Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the OTT.X Wednesday webinar series. My name is Jose Rodriguez, and on behalf of all of us at OTT.X, we would like to thank you for joining us to this series where we are delighted to bring you insightful, thought-provoking presentations across a broad spectrum of OTT-related topics from thought leaders from across our industry. Today, we have a very special webinar focused on the topic of women's sports and OTT that will be split up into two portions. First, we will be joined by Omdia Senior Media and Entertainment Analyst, Ed Ludlow, for an overview of women's sports and OTT and its incredible growth as streaming platforms increasingly spend billions of dollars on live sports rights to attract and retain subscribers, with Amazon's acquisition of the NFL Thursday Night Football and Apple's TV deal with MLS as prime examples. After Ed's presentation, he will interview Stuart McLean, the CEO of Fast Studios, a pioneer in providing sports-related content via OTT. Fast Studios is a home for OTT channels including Spartan TV, Racing America, and most notably the Women's Sports Network, with support from 12 professional women's sports leagues and federations, including the WNBA, the LPGA, the US Ski and Snowboard, and Athletes Unlimited. The Women's Sports Network is a single point of access for the very best of women's sports. We would love to thank both Omdia and Fast Studios for putting this presentation together and being part of our thriving OTT community. Please feel free to drop in your questions in the Q&A bin, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end of the presentation. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ed. Ed, the stage is all yours. Welcome.
Thanks, Jose. Yeah, I'll just try and share my screen quickly first. Can you confirm if you get it up?
Absolutely.
Can you see that now?
Yeah, looks great.
Fantastic. Yeah, well, yeah, thanks again, Jose, for that kind of introduction. Really excited to be talking with you all today. I'm just going to introduce myself again. Yeah, Ed Ludlow. I'm a senior data analyst at Omdia, or senior mansplainer, as my colleague Matt kind of unfortunately referred to me earlier on, but I hope I'm not going to do too much mansplaining to you today. I really just want to sort of contextualize the women's sports industry. And if you allow me to be sincere just for a second, I just really want to emphasize that the purpose of this conversation is to be additive. And I'm really want to put forward the case for women's sport and show why it makes sense for broadcasters to get behind. So yeah, if you want a copy of the slide deck, please don't hesitate to contact me. My email address is just there, and I'll leave it at the end of the presentation as well. Okay, so getting into it. So I'm coming from Omdia, which is a media and analyst firm based out of London in England. Sorry, an analyst and consultancy firm based out of London, England. And in particular, I'm coming from the media and entertainment pillar. So we actually have expertise across the technology, media and telecom space. And we have experts in each sector, which means that there's a huge cross-pollination of ideas and data from one pillar to another. And this gives us a holistic view of the industry and really adds to our research and our findings, and that's what we hope provides our sort of expertise and makes us stand apart in the sector. And like I said, today I'm going to be presenting about the media landscape for women's sports. So just quickly, what I'm going to cover is how women's professional sport is represented in the media. I'm going to talk a bit about a case study, which was the Women's Euros, which was a soccer competition which happened in the UK last year, 2022. I'm going to then talk about online and traditional broadcasting models and how the media landscape is changing in regards to sport. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about how fast can capitalize on this changing landscape. So what do we mean by women's sport? It's not necessarily a question which is as easy as it sounds. Obviously, when we're talking about women's sport, we're talking about sport played by women, but you have to think in the professional context that can come in a couple of guises. There are women's events and there are mixed events and there are men's events. And when we're talking about women's events, what we have to point out is that women's professional sport is a lot younger than men's professional sport in a lot of instances. So the women's events, which are professional, there are a fewer number of women's leagues in that regard. But for the purpose of this conversation, when I'm talking about women's events, I'm talking about events in which only women can participate, and they're usually organized separately from men's events with independent governing bodies. Mixed events are obviously events in which both genders can participate. So in the Olympics, you wouldn't necessarily have a woman participating against a man, but it will have both men and women participants under the same banner. Whereas in something like the WNBA, they have its own governing body and it's sort of separate to the NBA. But for the purpose of today's conversation, I'm really going to be referring to these two left-hand brackets, women's events and mixed events. And what's interesting is when we're talking about those women's events and mixed events, when we're thinking about the way in which media rights are sold, it's not necessarily split down the middle like you might think. So obviously an event like the Olympics, it's hard to extricate the women's events from the men's events because they're happening side by side all the time. But if we're talking about something like the WNBA, like I said, it has its own scheduling, it's its own teams. So therefore the events are sold separately. So when broadcasters like CBS are coming to buy it, they can just choose to broadcast the women's leagues. But that's not to say that these leagues don't necessarily sometimes couple. And what do I mean by coupling? Well, that's when two leagues will partner, a men's league and a women's league will partner up together and sell their media rights as a bundle. So the LPGA is an example of that, where it's in the United States. What they've done is they partnered with the PGA, which is the male golfing federation, and when they've sold their rights packages, they've sold it as a bundle. But that's not necessarily, again, my point here is that it's not necessarily an easy distinction, because the WTA, which is quite an analogous league, but for tennis, when they sell their media rights, they sell them separately. Now, there are benefits of both. There are benefits of selling them separately altogether. When you're selling them separately, you can sort of see how much your media rights are worth in the market. So you can see how much people are willing to pay for them. So women's leagues can gauge their success. But when you sell them, when you're selling them together, there's sometimes a revenue incentive in the sense that sometimes you're able to achieve better revenues from those rights. But again, something I want to point out is that not all women's leagues are actually even being able to monetize their rights. A lot of them are still in the growth stage. And actually, will just when they're sorting out distribution deals with broadcasters, the deal in place will just be that we'll give you the rights for free, but you have to sort the broadcasting costs associated with that. So in that context, which are the most profitable leagues? And what we're going to see here is, as you might expect, tennis sort of stands in front of the rest of the pack. Tennis has $52 million per year in terms of their revenue gained from media rights. The other sort of American or US college sports does well. So the NCAA and the WNBA also stands there in the top three. And the Women's Premier League cricket is also an interesting example, a recent league which has also achieved quite significant revenues from its broadcasting rights. The soccer league stands some way behind, but what's something to point out is that these leagues tend to earn the most from their domestic league. So obviously the women's soccer leagues usually operate in slightly smaller markets than obviously the US and even India, which is huge. But I think this is really to sort of compare this, we need to look at the way in which women's league stands versus the men's league. And disclaimer, the picture's not so rosy. So if we look at the WTA in comparison to the ATP, we can see there's still a long way to go. It's 3.14 times less valuable. And what does that mean? It means that there's obviously women's leagues are perhaps undervalued in that respect, but also there's perhaps some revenue potential there, that women's leagues might be undervalued. So therefore, there's plenty of room to grow. And if we think the WTA is bad, wait until I'll show you this slide. If we look at the Premier League soccer, so Premier League soccer is the first division of men's football in the UK. And what you can see is that the gap is huge, 563 times more valuable than women's Premier League, which is the first division of women's soccer in the UK. So yeah, clearly there's a big discrepancy, and we can look at that sort of negatively and think that yes, women's leagues are super undervalued, and yes, they are. But equally, again, there's an opportunity there. So how does this translate to earnings? Now, what we can see here is on-field and off-field earnings for professional athletes. And what we have here on the top is the top 10 male athletes, and on the bottom is the top 10 female athletes. And what you can see is obviously the men are slightly ahead of the women in that regard. Now, what we've also got a division of is on-field versus off-field performance. So how much are those athletes earning from endorsements versus their on-field pay from winning tournaments, etc. And what you can see is that the women's earnings are mostly made up of those top earning athletes are mostly made up from off-field endorsement deals. Whereas the men's, it's a bit more equal. Also, something I want to point out here is that most of these women athletes play an individual sport. So we have tennis, skiing, gymnastics, and golf. Whereas those men's teams, those men's athletes are playing in team sports. So what that can again might show is what I was just showing you in the last slide, that actually sports like soccer have huge broadcasting rights deals, and that hasn't necessarily filtered down to the women's game. So where do the women stand in comparison to the men? Well, Naomi Osaka, who was the top earning athlete in 2022, female athlete in 2022, only lands at 19th overall. Serena Williams, she's 31st overall, and that's only 2 women in the top 50 of for earnings amongst athletes altogether. So there's only 2 female athletes. It's staggering, really, and shows how long we have to go, or how far there is still to go. And neither of these athletes even earn as much as Canelo Alvarez did just in his prize money in 2022. He took home 85 million just in his prize money from boxing bouts that he participated in. So why is this? Well, if we're looking here now, we're looking at actual prize money that they're earning from the events. And I think something to point out here is that it's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison. What I'm trying to do is compare the amount of money that a first place finished at a women's event earns in comparison to a men's event. And what you can see is in certain instances, men earn more than women for winning those tournaments. And I think the reason that is if we're talking about individual events, tennis, for example, in which only one participant is participating, they tend to have a bit more parity. So Grand Slam tennis has enforced equal prize money in the US since 1973. So that's why women and men earn equally. But in those team competitions, that money goes to the federation rather than the individuals, especially in international soccer. And as a result, there's maybe a bit more discrepancy, but like I say, we're not comparing apples to apples there. It's sort of apples to pear comparison. But yeah, whereas also something to point out about Grand Slam tennis is that while women are earning the same at Grand Slams, on other events in the WTA Tour, they're not earning that much. So while Grand Slam have parity, a lot of the other competitions don't. So even with tennis, which probably stands at the front of this queue, there's still a long way to go. And that's just my point about international soccer having at least parity. So next up, I'm going to talk about the Women's Euros 2022. Some of you may or may not know what happened here. This was a football or soccer competition which happened in the UK in 2022. It was huge for people like me because this was the first time that England had won a soccer tournament since 1966. So it was a really big event in England. The event took place in England, and it really captured the imagination of the public. So the Women's Euros is a competition. It's a competition which involves European international teams, so England, France, Germany, etc. It's a soccer tournament which takes place in a variety of locations. And this year, the majority of the event took place in the UK or in England, and it's massively grown. What you can see is since 2013 in Sweden, the event's grown 3 times, and it's doubled the size of the event in 2017. So this is in terms of viewership, how many people were tuning in to watch the event. But still, again, if we make the comparison to the men's event, it's still got a long way to go. It had 14 times fewer viewers across the world. This is global viewership than the men's event. And also had cheaper rights. So what I'm looking at here is the value of the rights deals in the UK. So this is how much the rights deals sold for. And what we can see is that they went for 13 million in the UK versus 226 million odds in the UK. So there's a huge disparity there. And why that is interesting is this. because actually by the time we got to the final, the viewership wasn't all that different. Whereas the media rights sold to 17 times less, in the final, only 1.7 times fewer people watched the final than the men's event. So these two events were quite analogous. The men's Euros was an event which happened the year before. It was, again, the same competition, but it was only a year different. It happened in the UK, so very easily comparable. And what you can see is that the peak audience for the final, yeah, like I said, there was a 1.7 times difference. So what does that mean? That means that especially for big events, there's a opportunity gap there. Whereas the rights are being undersold or undervalued and by 17 times, in terms of viewership, that difference isn't so much. So this is really illustrating the fact that these sports rights, especially for competitions in which a team does well or progresses far, can really capture the imagination of a population and can therefore be undervalued. And what does this mean? I mean, something else important to point out is of those viewers of the women's event, many are completely different to the viewers of the men's event. What do I mean by that? 1.8 million people didn't watch the FIFA Men's World Cup in 2022, but did watch the Women's Euros. So what does that mean? That means that 1.8 million people didn't engage at all with the men's event, but were enticed by the women's event. And why is that important? Well, that's important because this is a whole new audience which men's football or men's soccer isn't reaching. And brands can capitalize off that opportunity. There are audiences which they can capture, which they aren't reaching through men's events. And a league which has already done this, I'm going to take the example away from football for the time being, or sorry, soccer for the time being. I'm going to talk about basketball. Because if we look at the WNBA, they've started to capitalize off this unique audience. What we can see here is the industry sector of the shirt sponsors. Now, the NBA has more teams than the WNBA, but the WNBA has 2 shirt sponsors on their jersey, whereas NBA team has just 1 shirt sponsor. Or jersey sponsor, I suppose. And what we can think about here is that that means that there is roughly an analogous number of shirt sponsors across the 2 leagues. And what's interesting is when I was looking at the companies, or the industry sectors which those companies are operating of those shirt sponsors, banking and financial services index very highly for men's events, but not so highly for women's events. And also universities and healthcare index much higher for women's events. So brands are starting to realize that they can capitalize off a new audience for women's sport. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about OTT and FAST and the way the sports landscape is shaping up. I'm going to assume everyone knows what I'm talking about when I'm talking about OTT, and especially in FAST. In the UK, that's not necessarily an assumption that I can make, but Jose assured me that you guys would know. So what am I looking at here? I'm looking at the broadcasting rights values of the major sports groups. And this is looking at which of the sports, or which broadcasters spend the most on sport. And I think it's a really interesting snapshot because it shows the way in which sports has developed. 10 years ago, all or I'd say the vast majority of sports broadcasting would have happened across traditional linear means. So it would have happened across traditional broadcasting. And therefore, the largest groups would have been traditional linear broadcasters. But increasingly, what we're seeing is streamers entering that space. And now, as of 2023, 3 of those top 10 are actually streaming first. That means they're putting their content online and only accessible online. And something else to point out is all of these other broadcasters will also have online transmission methods. So people can watch their broadcasts either on their television through traditional means or through online transmission. But the problem with sports streaming for a long time has been latency. What does that mean? That means that if I'm watching a broadcast, the feed that I'm watching online is a couple of seconds behind the feed which is actually you might get through over the air transmission. Why is that an issue? Well, I might see a notification about what's happening in the game on my phone, or alternatively, I might have be gambling on an event, and if my feed is behind, that's massively going to impact my the sort of odds that I'm receiving. It's going to short my odds massively. So it's really important. Latency is a really important issue for sports broadcasting. And what we're finding is, although for a long time this latency has been a massive issue, it's becoming less of a problem. So what am I talking about here? This is latency of the Super Bowl. And what we can see is that in the Super Bowl of 2023, there's some research done by the Streamable. The over-the-air transmission, there was a 17-second gap between the over-the-air transmission and the transmission through cable. But for the first time, or I think the second time in their recording history, online apps, or a online app in particular, the Fox Sports app, actually had less of a latency than the cable transmission. Now, that's not to say that was true across the board. The NFL app and Hulu was some way behind, like you can see on my visual here, but crucially, the Fox Sports app was able to, in effect, keep up with over-the-air broadcasting. And the way they did this was by having a single national feed rather than using affiliate networks in each region that they were covering. So that was really important for increasing the speed and latency in the US. Now, why is that important for FAST? Well, FAST is growing massively. So the global FAST revenues, this is some research done by my colleague, Matt Bailey. He's shown that by 2027, they're expecting global revenues to reach 12 billion. And the majority of those revenues are going to be in the United States. Though it's important to point out other markets are also growing: UK, Canada, Australia, and Germany. So, because FAST is growing and latency is decreasing, the incentive of putting sport on FAST is growing. And increasingly what we're going to see is FAST channels dedicating themselves to live sport. And we've already seen it. LG Channels has the largest sports offering on FAST, but what we can see is across the board, this is looking at the number of channels on FAST services. Across the board, what you can see is each of those platforms have a really significant sports offering. And that's important because FAST is in many ways what people are considering the new cable. And what we're going to see here is I'm comparing the genres of traditional linear feeds versus FAST channels. Now, it's probably important to point out that traditional linear channels still have a larger proportion of sport, and that's what you might expect. Like I was explaining before, sport still is wedded to traditional linear broadcasting, but 9% of FAST channels are now dedicated to sport, and that's a really impressive figure. And something that I should point out is that actually only one of those channels is dedicated to women's sport, and that's why I'm really thrilled to be chatting to Stuart very shortly, because his channel, the Women's Sport Network, is the only channel which covers that in the United States. DAZN has also launched their own FAST service, their own women's sport channel in Europe. But when we're talking about the United States, the Women's Sports Network stands apart. So I'm going to finish with this slide. It's just looking at the live coverage and the event coverage of those FAST channels. What do we mean, and which areas they're covering? So this chart on the left is looking at the event focus of those sports channels. And what you can see is the sports agnostic channels, as you might expect, stand quite well. So by sports agnostic, I'm talking about channels which don't necessarily specify on one sport, but rather have a combination or a variety of different sports that they're broadcasting. But also martial arts scores really well. And that's because there's loads of, in martial arts and combat sports, loads of different federations which have their own events, and they've used FAST as a means in which to distribute each of those events. Oh, that's a bit like that. But something else I'd like to point out here is, in particular, some of the more niche sports. So cornhole, bull riding, strongman, billiards. These are all sports which wouldn't necessarily receive traditional linear broadcasting deals. And I think that's important to remember in regards to women's sports, because on FAST, there is the potential for these more niche sports to gain a market. And then finally, on the right-hand side, I'm just going to talk very quickly about the coverage type of those channels. And what's important to point out is that live coverage now accounts for 42% of the channels. So 42% of those channels now offer some sort of live transmission. That's not to say they're exclusively live, but they will each offer a component of live transmission. The rest of their broadcast might be made from these other content types that we're talking about here. So instructional videos, highlights and archive, maybe some documentary features. But yeah, really important that live is a really important component of FAST, and niche sports have a place on FAST. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope kept time. I think that sets up quite nicely the next part of my conversation with Stuart. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Hi, Stuart. How's it going?
Hey, Ed. How are you?
Yeah, I'm not bad, thanks. I've been at a conference all day and my throat's starting to hurt a little bit, but hopefully I can make it through this Q&A. But thanks for talking with me. And I think, should we just get the ball rolling? Do you want to introduce yourself and introduce FAST Studios and what you guys do?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, and thanks to OTT.X. We are members and big fans of everything that Mark and the team are doing. I'm Stuart McLean. I'm CEO of FAST Studios. We are creators and operators of FAST streaming channels. We weren't too proud not to take the category name. We launched the company just a little over 2.5 years ago. We currently have 3 channels in market. This can be my Vanna White moment. The first is Racing America, which is a joint venture that we have with the NASCAR Cup team owners, very biggest names in motorsports. That channel, we deliver about 15 hours of live racing a week, plus news, plus great team content from Hendricks, Penske, Hendricks, etc. Spartan TV, which is our sports lifestyle channel. Unfortunately, we couldn't fit them into frame here. Most of you might be familiar with Spartan Races, where you run a 5K and have to go through a crazy obstacle course. It's a global brand in 40 markets. And that was attractive to us because of the really dedicated fan base. So that's sports lifestyle. So it's the championship races from Spartan, plus cooking shows, morning workout shows, etc. So for those of you who want to be unbreakable, Spartan TV is for you. And then our latest effort is the Women's Sports Network, which we're really proud of, that we launched in November.
Great. Well, thanks for that introduction, Stuart. That's cool. And I think, yeah, I think we're going to try and focus this conversation a little bit on this Women's Sport Network. Actually, sorry, just stepping back for a second. Let's stick on FAST Studios. And can you just talk a little bit behind why you thought of creating this brand? Like, what was it which pulled you towards?
So we launched the studio just a little over 2 years ago, and I think we saw what everyone was seeing, which is once Fox came in and bought Tubi, and Comcast bought Xumo, and Paramount bought Pluto. To us, it very much was the reinvention of cable television. And our thesis was, now that the major media companies are coming into the space, you have to take kind of a go big or go home strategy. And so for all of our networks, we won't launch a network with fewer than 1,000 hours of programming. We have leaned heavily into live, and are really anticipating that we're calling this FAST now, but in 2 years, we're just all going to call this TV. It's going to take probably a little time to get there, but that was the thesis behind the studio.
No, I think it's a great point. Yeah, I think you're quite right on that, because I think in effect what we're looking at is just television. There's just channels, right? There shouldn't be a distinction. But yeah, let's talk about the Women's Sport Network then. Firstly, can you just let us know a bit about where you're operating?
Oh, sure. So the channel now is primarily US based. We're out on about 80% of the tier 1 distributors. So, that would include, Roku, Amazon, Tubi, Vizio, LG. And, in this marketplace, that's primarily where the action is from an audience standpoint. So I encourage everyone to tune in on any of those platforms, and womensports.com, you can see the rest.
Awesome, yeah. And so what was the when you were sort of leading towards it, or I guess coming up with it, why did you decide that now was the time for women's sport?
Well, we really looked at three key factors, and we do this for all of our channels. And the Women's Sports Network, we literally only started putting it together a year and a half ago. It's one of the exciting things about fast is speed is you can be fast to market, no pun intended. But it really started with a report that the Sports Innovation Lab did called the Fan Project. And if you're not familiar with the Fan Project and you're interested in women's sports, I would encourage you to read it. And it really started to break down who is the fan of women's sports. You touched on it a bit in your overview there, Ed. But what we saw was a very tech savvy, very purpose driven fan base. This is a fan base that has had to hunt and peck their way around to find the athletes that they want to watch. And the other really interesting note on fans of women's sports is brand affinity. They're very valuable customers. So we really started there, and it felt like the right environment. And then when we started talking to the leagues and the teams and the federations, I'd certainly never heard a level of frustration on that kind of listening tour. And the obvious frustration was amount of media coverage. I think everyone's pretty familiar now with the stats running, about 5% of sports media coverage on a good day, maybe 10. And the other thing that was kind of interesting to us was the women's sports leagues and federations, they're also tend to be under-resourced, and that can be from production, from staffing, from social media expertise, and the like. So we really saw an opportunity here to be, if you think about what the NFL network is to the NFL, the Women's Sports Network is that for the entire women's sports category. So to date, we're north of about 15 professional leagues and federations. We're really here as an opportunity for them to sell more product, which is what the sponsors are asking for. So the sponsors were also having an equal amount of frustration trying to support these athletes. And there have been a lot of really great brands that have raised their hands to say, we want to support these athletes, but it's also been hard for them to execute. So all of those things really came together nicely when we were putting the network together.
Awesome, yeah. And I mean, so just talking about the network, so which leagues in particular do you cover?
So we pretty much everyone's in. It's all the WNBA, LPGA, skiing, Athletes Unlimited. There are a couple that we're just closing up now. But I think what was super interesting, certainly from my seat as a publisher, and I have a marketing background, was that all of the leagues saw the value in coming in together. And no one kind of threw elbows to say, hey, we'll come in, but we only want to be in prime time. And I found that very interesting. And I think it's really a watershed moment for women's sports, where the Women's Sports Network is just one piece of the puzzle to try to get more viewership on the athletes. But the league certainly saw the value there. And what's exciting for us as we get our early data points in, the network's only been in market since November, is we're seeing tune in for a specific sport, and then that fan is sticking around and sampling other sports. And we're really encouraged about that. We weren't totally sure whether that was really going to happen or not, but we are seeing that starting to happen. So that is starting to pay off the value from all of these leagues banding together behind the Women's Sports Network.
Awesome, yeah. And I mean, in terms of, you sort of touched on that a bit there, I suppose, but like, what sort of programming are you offering for coverage of those leagues?
So we've invested quite a bit in original programming. As you can probably appreciate, being a new sports media brand coming to market, we had to play within the existing rights deals that were in market. So our biggest investment to date, which is really our signature show, is Game On. which is a daily studio show. It's our version of SportsCenter, only way better. Completely focused on women's sports. It's the only product of its kind in market. It's doing incredibly well. And we were super excited on the traction that Game On has had since launch. As you can probably appreciate, trying to explain to the sports community that there's a new network in this environment called FAST, and it's a new show. Would you please book your talent on here? We were a little nervous about, but everybody has come on the show, and something we're really proud of. And we've covered some pretty heavy topics like Title IX to, having the championship defender from the Thorns on after the championship game. So that's one of our tent poles. We do a lot of original lifestyles. What we've been hearing from the fans is they want more story. And this isn't unique, by the way, to women's sports, but it does seem to play a little heavier in terms of off the field interest in these athletes. These are moms, these are business owners, as well as championship athletes. So being able to capture those stories, the first in a series of 12 that we just launched, for example, is The World According to Sage. And that's Sage Erickson, championship surfer, who's fabulous. And she's won the US Open twice. And we did 6 half hours with her, where she's taking us through her favorite waves, her favorite taco stand in Cabo, as well as all the work that she does to get young girls up into surfing. And then we have kind of blocks of times by each league partner. We do about 20 to 30 hours of originals for each league partner. That includes best ofs, countdowns, and about, I would say, about 15% of our schedule now is live games.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I think it's really interesting what you're talking about in terms of those lifestyle elements. I was at a sports conference last week and everyone was talking about those are small federations saying, how can we recreate F1 Drive to Survive, which is that huge Netflix hit, really help expand the sport. And interestingly, the LPGA, or sorry, the PGA and also the Tennis Association, ATP, both recently launched their own versions of that series on Netflix. I found it really interesting to see that the ATP, the tennis tournament, wasn't just the ATP, but it was actually covering both the male and female athletes. Whereas the golf tournament or the golf show, Full Swing, was just looking at the male athletes, even though there's a huge, the LPGA is a huge federation. And actually the only female participants or talking heads in that documentary were, the only female participants were the wives and girlfriends, pretty much, of the male athletes, which I just thought was such a missed opportunity to help grow the women's game. But yeah, just touching back on
just to build on that a little bit, I think what's kind of interesting about women's sports is there's an opportunity here to kind of rewrite the playbook, right? Men's sports is delivered in a tried and true format, from rights to story to everything. And I think there's an opportunity here to get creative in not only how the Women's Sports Network, delivers, but also, other media outlets that are supporting women's sports. And certainly, leaning into story, as we see this growth and we see this interest, there's so much running room here to make these athletes household names. And, a lot of these leagues are, on the continuum, relatively new. I mean, even the WNBA is only 25 years old. And so, there is plenty of room here. And certainly the younger fan has raised their hands to say, yes, we want to hear these stories. So we're really happy to be able to deliver those on the Women's Sports Network.
Yeah, and I think you guys doing great work in that space as well. I mean, just touching on the live sports coverage that you have, is that exclusive coverage or is that shared with other broadcasters?
A little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
The Women's Sports Network in kind of this early iteration, a lot of the times we like to describe ourselves as being surround sound, right? So, and we're kind of happy to throw to some larger players in there as we broadcast. We did we're just wrapping up Athletes Unlimited basketball. We got the entire season featured on the Women's Sports Network. That wasn't necessarily exclusive to us. They also were on the WNBA app as well. But I think what's interesting and what's attractive to the league partners is our ability to stunt and extend, right? So, you know, for us, any and all live and all the programming that comes to us from our league partners is super valuable. But we like to say you're always in season on the Women's Sports Network. So we'll stand up Athletes Unlimited basketball now. We might do a rerun later in the year or prep best of as they roll into next season, help drive ticket sales, help drive awareness, all of that. And again, if you go back to that kind of NFL network to the NFL analogy, and the women's sports being that Uber marketing partner for all of our league partners, that's really where we're seeing a lot of value that we can offer back to our league partners.
Okay, yeah, and I mean, just in terms of your that sort of coverage, are you providing your own cameras and camera crews? Or are you collecting that broadcast feed from other parties?
We're catching it from games that are already being produced.
Right. Okay.
We've been asked. We certainly have the capability to do live production. And, you know, for us, particularly in these early days, we're trying not to disrupt the ecosystem too much. So, you know, the more it can be turnkey as we grow this brand, we think the better. And if there's a need, if we can be helpful to provide live production resources, we're happy to do it. But currently we've been picking up feeds that are sent to us.
Awesome. Yeah. And I mean, just in terms of there's obviously a technical element of broadcasting live sport, and especially over online transmission methods. Can you speak a bit to that?
Sure. Yeah, live is a little trickier in this space. It's getting easier. You know, we're certainly not seeing, it was interesting, your stat on the Fox app, like we're not seeing any difficulty there in terms of quality. Mm-hmm. I think in the fast space, since it's rigged up for the programmatic exchanges, there's some kind of technical gymnastics you need to do to make sure that the brakes are correct, that the triggers and all of that. And that's an area that I think can continue to improve. But I think what's exciting for us, even as a new growing brand, is we are seeing tune in. And you know, unlike what, you know, Amazon's doing with football, where you would, you know, they're building a business around that. In the fast space, live tuning is relatively new, and we're now seeing that pop. You know, we're also promoting it like crazy, which I think helps. And it's really important in this space to market your networks accordingly, and to market your programming. You know, you have to nurture it. So we are seeing tune in. We were, and I think our partners at Athletes Unlimited were really pleased with both the quality, the viewership numbers, the marketing and promotion around their basketball season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, maybe that's a good chance to maybe talk about your relationships with the leagues themselves. So, I mean, how have you developed those relationships, or how are you developing those relationships? And I guess also, are you helping them with like sort of the scheduling of their events? Are you advising in that capacity? Is it like a mutual relationship?
Well, yeah, it's very much becoming that. I mean, you know, I'm very fortunate. I have a partner in Carol Stiff, who was in charge of women's programming at ESPN for 30 years. And, you know, she's certainly a trusted partner within the women's sports community, and someone that helps build out those league deals. And, you know, I think what we're really encouraged by is, as we're seeing super positive performance on the network and the numbers and the like, we're getting more inbound, right, from our league partners, say, oh, well, maybe you can help us here, could you help us there, which is exactly what we're anticipating. You know, you have to put some points on the board before you can really have those meaningful conversations. But, you know, it really runs the gamut. Interestingly enough, even both from the larger leagues to some of the smaller, newer leagues, again, they're really all facing very similar challenges. So our ability to market, to stunt, to be additive to what they're already doing is where we're hearing that's adding value to the overall proposition.
Awesome. I mean, thanks for that feedback. I think I see some questions in the chat, and I have a couple of my own, but I think maybe I'll just give you one more and then maybe let's open it up to the chat.
Sure.
So if the chat does have any more questions, please feel free to pile them in now so we can get them to Stuart before the end of the session. But yeah, I think my last question then would just be perhaps your target demographic. Who are you looking to reach through the Women's Sport Network?
Well, it's a good question when we get quite a bit. So again, we go back to the fan data that we have, which is 60-40 male female. In a lot of initial conversations, and when you carry a name like the Women's Sports Network, there's an assumption that only women want to watch women's sports, and that's certainly not the case. We're also tracking with the same data that you're seeing, which is this is separated a bit from men's sports, and which makes them very valuable. In terms of demographics, it basically follows the CTV audience, which is younger. So I think the last stat we saw was 60%, 18 to 34, 40%, or 30%. 25 to 54, and then 55 plus is only like in the high teens. So it is a younger, more tech savvy audience, which is great, and that very much mirrors the original data that we saw for fans of women's sports, which is why we thought that this would be a good idea, from a fan perspective, to deliver this in the FAST ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think that's a great idea as well. I mean, in the sense that if you capture a fan at those younger age groups and you can sort of watch their progression throughout their lives, and hopefully you can bring them through, nurture that interest in sport, nurture the interest in your product. I think it's a really effective business model. But yeah, I mean, thanks again, Stuart. I think I'm going to bring Jose back in to perhaps ask these questions from the audience.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Ed and Stuart. That was a phenomenal conversation and presentation. I enjoyed it thoroughly. We do have a couple quick questions here from our guest today. And Stuart, this one is directed at you, first of all. People want to know if you're interested in bringing the Women's Sports Network to the UK. Looks like there is a plan for that.
Yeah, we are planning on rolling the network out outside the US. We have plans to do that. So hopefully we'll see it soon in the UK.
Awesome. Great to hear. And Ed, this one's for you, it looks like. Looks like there's interest to see if there are specific teams or maybe even specific leagues that are kind of leading the charge and getting women's sports notoriety out there. Do you have any type of data on that?
Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, no, but I think it's quite right in the sense that certain professional teams have obviously made a more of an impact in sort of promoting their women's leagues and women's teams. I mean, in the UK, the scenario, or actually in most of Europe, the scenario is a bit different to the US, where as in the US, there are separate males and female teams. In Europe, those teams tend to be the same. So you'll have a Arsenal women's and an Arsenal men's, if we're going to take a soccer example. And yeah, I mean, Arsenal is a great example of one of those teams which has actually done a really good job. I mean, had a lot of success with their women's team, and also just promoting the sport. There was an event at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, I think last year, which was actually the most highly attended women's sport event ever, I think I'm right in saying, and had roughly 90,000 attendees. So yes, I think there is, like I said, off the top of my head, I don't have any stats on which leagues or teams have performed better. But yeah, if people are interested, like I say, feel free to drop me an email or get in touch, and I'm sure we can provide some insights.
Absolutely. Great. And then Stuart, do you have anything planned or in mind to cover this upcoming Women's World Cup, which I believe is taking place in August?
We do. So we will be doing some original content around the Women's World Cup. Obviously, Fox spent a lot of money to broadcast the Cup, so we won't have any live coverage, but we will have plenty of story in and around, and we will be looking to be partnering with Fox on some of that as well.
That's great. Awesome. And Stuart, I got one more for you. This is a pretty big question, so let's see what you come up with. What is the biggest challenge you have faced when you were coming up with and setting up the Women's Sports Network?
Well, it was, I have to be honest, it was a heavy lift, and it was only a heavy lift because there was such a tremendous pull from the marketplace of wanting this channel out. And so our lift came with, by the end of this year, we'll have 1,500 hours of original programming. So, we needed a minimum base to launch with that all had to be produced. So that was really probably the biggest challenge, was making sure that we were bringing a quality product to market, with enough content to get a channel launched. And so fortunately, I have a phenomenal team here at Fast Studios that did an incredible job putting the network together. And quite honestly, the biggest challenge was keeping up with the demand. And it's been a great ride, and we hope it's going to continue, but it was, we put all of this together. We literally had our first conversation July 21, I guess it was. Is that right? Yeah. So under about a year and a half, all of this was put together. So we've been pedaling pretty fast over here.
Yeah, that's incredible. And we definitely owe you a thank you, Stuart, because as Ed pointed out earlier in the presentation, the Women's Sports Network is the only one, catering specifically toward women, and it's definitely needed, especially in this new space. So that's awesome. I love what you're doing.
We have great partners in the leagues and the teams and the athletes as well. So this is most definitely a team effort for sure.
All right, and let's see if we have one more here. And I think that's going to be it for today, guys. Thank you so much once again. Thank you, Ed and Stuart, for a great overview of sports and OTT at such a fascinating time for the industry. We can't wait to see where we go from here. We'd also like to thank the viewers for joining us today. This session has been recorded and will be available online at OTT.X.org in the coming days. We also have a lot of exciting events on the horizon, beginning with our New York Roundtable discussions, which will be taking place on April 4th. Join an exclusive think tank of industry experts to take a deep dive on pressing issues such as search and discovery and much more. On April 18th, we'll be hosting an exclusive networking breakfast at the NAB show. Network with industry executives and fuel up with the hearty breakfast before another day of excitement at NAB. And finally, the OTT.X X fronts are quickly approaching, where Stuart initially made some of the announcements for the Women's Sports Network. This year, they'll be taking place on May 23rd and 24th at the Skirball Cultural Center in Los Angeles. Learn about the intricacies and opportunities in the FAST market and take part in panels, presentations, research findings, and interactive roundtable discussions focused on the growth of FAST and how it is being utilized to get the most out of advertising spends. This year's program looks absolutely phenomenal, and you can learn more about this and everything having to do with OTT.X by visiting us at OTT.X.org. Thank you once again, Ed and Stuart, and everyone in attendance. We hope you have a great day and rest of your week. Thank you guys so much. Have a good one.
Thanks, Jose. Thanks, Ed.
Bye.